Web controls, using code behind. In this nugget, I'm going to briefly sort of give you an overview of how the web code behind model works. I know that we've already looked at a lot of it and seen it in action, but I just kind of want to formally make sure that you know some of the terms and the processes and everything else. And then, you know what, we're just going to keep this a short one. This will kind of be a break between a couple of longer nuggets. We're going to talk about the differences between URL encode and HTML encode, how to use them, and why you might care. I'll show you the find control method and tell you why you might care. And talk about something that's brand new in ASP.NET 4, which is the ability to control the version of HTML or the style of HTML that's rendered from ASP.NET controls. So let's just briefly talk about what the code behind model looks like. You don't have to do your web pages this way. In other words, this is my web page. This is the ASPX page. This is designed to be the visual portion of my web page. Here in the source, there's actually very little code. There are some registration directives and things like that, but this is mostly just visuals. Now, some of these aren't actually HTML tags. This is obviously not an HTML tag. This is going to run at the server, and the server is going to execute this control and produce some actual HTML. So on the client side, this is going to look very different. You've got standard HTML tags in here, though, and it's completely feasible to put all of your code in this page as well. You know, you can put the traditional ASP tags and dim variables and do whatever else you want to do in here. So you could build your entire web application so that your code and your presentation are all in the same place. With the code behind model, though, you're separating this presentation, this visual portion of your application, the UI, from the code. So the code lives back here. And ASP.NET maintains the information necessary to connect these two to one another so that when this page gets created, the right events in this code file get run. When this page gets posted back to the server, let's say somebody clicks this button here, it'll post back and it'll execute the code in that page. In fact, I can go in here and double click that button, and it will create a little stub for the event handler. So this is the code that'll be executed. So that's the code behind model. The code sits behind the UI rather than in the UI. And it really it helps a web application more closely mimic the type of application development that you would normally do on a native operating system like WinForms or even a Java application, where typically your user interface is developed in one place, and then you have a file or a set of files that contain all the code that make it work. Makes it a little easier to maintain the code, makes it a little easier to make minor changes to the user interface. It's very easy for me to come in here, and in either this source view or design view, I can move this button right out of that panel, and I don't have to worry about upsetting any of the code. It also gives me the ability to use these rich, powerful controls that execute on the server and output HTML. And that actually brings us to our next topic, which is the control rendering compatibility version. In older versions of ASP.NET, Microsoft had these server-side controls outputting HTML that was not always the very, very best, let's say. They used a lot of tables to keep things lined up and aligned, and it made it very difficult as people wanted to move into more modern XHTML 4.0 compliant HTML to really embrace web standards like cascading style sheets and client-side scripting and things like that. So in an effort to be more XHTML 4.0 compatible, in an effort to produce HTML that CSS, cascading style sheet authors, will find easier to style, ASP.NET 4.0 is producing much simpler HTML. It's much more plain HTML, I guess you could say. It's still not the plainest thing in the universe, but it's definitely a little bit easier to read and see and figure out. Well, the problem is, if you're migrating a website, you might want that older HTML. You might have some things in place that rely on that. So what you can do is come into your web config file over here, and under system.web, we're going to add a quick pages section, and we're going to pick this control rendering compatibility version, and then we can set it to whatever we want. We'll say 3.5. That means the controls are going to render the same HTML that they would have rendered under ASP.NET 3.5 rather than the newer 4.0. So that's kind of a neat capability. Be aware that that's there. Definitely something that in certain circumstances you might have to take advantage of. Now our next topic is going to be another part of that code behind stuff, and it's how to find a particular control. Now obviously here it's, if I've defined a simple control like button 1, I can just get right to it. But in a much more complicated page or a more dynamic layout, then you might need to be able to find a control. So there is a find control method. It is implemented on most classes that are a container that can contain other controls. And it searches the current container, whichever one you invoke it on, for the specified server control. So we could just say, let's dim tb as a text box, and I'll show you why I'm going to do that in a second. We're going to set it equal to page, so we're asking the page to find a control named textbox1. And if it does find it, then that'll be placed in TB. And the reason I went ahead and dimensioned or declared TB as a text box is so that now I can type TB, hit period, and I'll get all the IntelliSense for a text box. If I had just declared this as a generic web UI control, then it wouldn't be able to give me these specifics. So it's going to go out and get that control and give me a reference to it. Pretty straightforward. The only time you run into trouble is if the text box isn't a child of the control that you query. Now, page being the top level thing, everything's going to be a member of that. You might want to find, let's see, I've got a panel in here. Panel 1 also has a find control. If panel 1 contains a text box, then I'll get something back. But if panel 1 doesn't contain a text box, then I'm not going to get anything back. So this can be an especially useful trick when you're working with data grids, because data grids or repeaters or data lists can contain a lot of embedded controls, many of which are going to be created at runtime, and so this gives you a way to locate those things. Now, speaking of text boxes and the code behind model, keep in mind one of the things that happens in code behind is people can interact with your user interface, type things in, and it gets posted back to your code. You've got to be a little bit careful about accepting input from users. We'd like to think that everybody out there is just going to be all nice and hunky-dory, but in reality there's some attackers out there and some malicious people, so you need to be a little careful of that. One thing people will do, if they know that they're going to be sending you something that you're going to display, is they can embed HTML in what they've sent you. So let's say you're asking someone to type in a comment on a blog, and in that comment they're going to put something like an object tag or something else that's going to load code from another website. One way to prevent that from happening is to escape out all the HTML that they type, so that any HTML will just be displayed as literal HTML. In other words, rather than interpreting the object tag, their comment would just include open bracket object blah 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 blah. Well, the way to do that is, let's say you've got something like this that's come back, and you've got it in a variable like this. So you can say dim encoded string, and you're going to use the server object, and it has an HTML encode and an HTML decode, and you just pass it the string. And all it's really going to do is, escape out these open and close angle brackets. It's also going to escape out the ampersand and slashes and stuff like that. So what this would wind up turning into is less than entity and a greater than entity. So that when you eventually display this, it's going to display as open bracket hello close bracket, but it's not going to be interpreted or executed by the destination browser as HTML. It's just going to be a literal string of text. So that's a really good little technique. As you saw when I did the IntelliSense there's an equivalent decode method, and that will decode that back into the normal HTML. There's another trick that's related to that. Whenever you're going to be building a URL, a link maybe that somebody would click. Let's say I've got, this is my text. I have characters in there, I I have characters in here that are not valid in a hyperlink. That's not valid. Single quotes, not valid. Spaces, technically not valid. Question mark, definitely not valid. So before I use that string to build a link, I want to URL encode it, and I can get it to it with the same thing. It's just URL encode, and you'll notice that there's a URL decode as well to go the other direction. And that will turn all of these things, including the spaces, into URL compatible little entities. It'll just put the character encoding there so that they can properly be stuck into a hyperlink, and they will operate as a URL. It's perfectly useful, great little tool to use, and definitely something you will use as you sort of bridge the gap between your code and your HTML-based user interface in your application. So this was a short nugget. It was really all about code behind in ASP.NET applications. Gave you a brief overview of what code behind is and how it works. Talked about HTML encoding and URL encoding. This is really a big one for security purposes. Kind of keep that in mind. Looked at the find control method, quick way to locate a control on a page if you need to refer to it and don't want to trace it through the hierarchy. And we talked about the control rendering versioning capability so that you can change the type of HTML that's output from different controls if you need to do so for compatibility versions. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.